In 1900, Africa had 10 million Christians, representing 10% of the population. By 2000, that 10 million had grown to 360 million, representing just under half the population, and it's still growing. In statistical terms, that is the largest religious change that has ever occurred on the planet of any kind, and most of us didn't even see it.
Meanwhile, a 2005 official British commission concluded, African poverty and stagnation is the greatest tragedy of our times.
One of the great paradoxes in today's world is that the continent where Christianity is experiencing its greatest growth is the very continent where human poverty, disease, and political instability are the greatest.
In sub-Saharan Africa, the estimate is about 2 to 2.5 million people are dying of AIDS each year. Again, it's a bit difficult to know exact numbers because a lot of times people don't admit that they have AIDS, and doctors are very unwilling to write that on a death certificate. A lot of times people who die of TB or malaria or pneumonia may also that might be a complication or an opportunistic infection that has come because of being HIV positive. So it's hard to know exact numbers, but UNAIDS, which is the United Nations agency that collects all this data, provides the number of roughly, I think last year they provided the number of 2.1 million people in sub-Saharan Africa.
To some, the problems of Africa appear so great they are tempted to give way to despair and hopelessness. But the good news of the Bible is that no matter how dark the night, Christ, not evil, is in charge. Jesus Christ and His grace are active in the world today. This is also true of Africa.
Africa is a continent rich in natural and human resources. Pastor Isaac Matua of Kitale, Kenya, expressed this truth well when he wrote, Africa is suffering, not because of scarcity, but because of what she has not utilized. God is reminding us that He is ready to liberate Africa from her problems, if her people will avail themselves and make use of what He has given them.
When we note the problems Africa is facing today, we need to remember that many who are facing these problems are our brothers and sisters in Christ. The great biblical principle of solidarity says we owe Africa our prayers and concern and our help. When one part of the church is suffering, surely the other part of the church needs to act.
I think one of the most important things that Americans can do is that they can continue to care about AIDS in Africa. And not just about AIDS, but about Africa. Foreign assistance to Africa, and particularly for AIDS and health issues, has gone up dramatically under the Bush administration. But the only reason that happens is if Americans care, and if they talk to their congressman and they join important interest groups on those issues. So I really think that's the most important thing, because to fight AIDS in Africa, Africa needs resources. African states just don't have the resources to provide antiretroviral drugs, to provide the testing that's needed to test pregnant women, to provide the massive care that's needed for orphans and vulnerable children. They have to have outside assistance.
I think the United States definitely has issues of its own with poverty. There are many people in the United States who are living in extreme conditions, and but the difference is we in the United States have the resources available to these people to use if they choose to. The social services agencies are there, and the money and the resources are in place for people to go to. In countries, in the African countries, those resources aren't available.
With the encouragement of many Christians and others, President Bush began the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR. It involves spending billions of dollars in Africa and elsewhere to battle against the AIDS epidemic. Much of this money is being funded through Christian organizations, such as MAP International.
The U.S. government voted in 2003 over 15 billion.
15 billion?
US dollars to support 15 countries, 12 of them in Africa, 2 in the Caribbean, Haiti and Guyana, and then 1 in Asia, Vietnam. So my role at MAP International, and this other new role as Senior Director, Health and Hope, is to work with the churches and faith-based groups to see how they can plug into the governments within their countries and how they could also benefit from some of these monies. Those go through governments, but also through some large NGOs.
Okay, and like, the NGOs, the
non-governmental organizations like World Vision, World Relief, and then MAP International, partnering with some of these organizations. Also, we access some of that money.
At many points, we have talked about the role played by civil society organizations in God's ordering of human societies. Dr. Peter O'Callaghan and his efforts are a living example of what those ideas mean. Others are also catching this vision.
Local congregations are the best organization to eradicate the disease. We have the largest distribution network, we have the greatest number of volunteers, and we possess the most credibility at the local village level. Businesses and governments and NGO will never be able to eradicate this epidemic without the local churches involved around the world.
Other Christian leaders are coming together to say that Christian overseas agencies are the best means to meet the needs of Africa. But they are also saying they cannot do it alone. When the financial resources of our government are combined with the dedication and the grassroots networks of faith-based overseas organizations, one has a combination that may very well be equal to the enormous needs Africa is facing today.
Well, the question is often raised best as follows. Does money that's given to foreign governments best serve those people in countries such as Africa, or does money that's given to non-governmental organizations best serve the recipients? And this is an ongoing debate here in Washington. I think that history would show that often dollars that go to foreign governments have historically, particularly in Africa, gone to the rich, the wealthy, the entitled, often to tyrants, rather than to who ought to be the recipients of these dollars. And so I think that President Bush's PEPFAR plan, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, in which money went to non-governmental organizations such as World Vision, World Relief, and Compassion International, and others, these kinds of non-governmental organizations are best shown to be more efficient, cost-effective. They aren't used, dollars aren't used to prop up tyrants, and so I happen to prefer that methodology.
People who are driven by other motives, who don't care about legacy, who are not worried about the next election, they will stay at the table. They will bring the credibility, they will bring the relevance, they will bring the impact to get the job done. Government has been smart. They have looked at faith-based organizations as an extension of the humanitarian reach. They've had to. It's practical. Now, do you give money? Do you give goods? Do you give help to a faith-based organization just because it's faith-based? No. You give it only because they can get the job done better than you can get the job done. If that's the case, then there should not be any limits.
You know, I think it is definitely more than a financial issue, though, and sometimes it gets confused to just be, well, let's donate this, X number of dollars in aid. But I think history has proven that we've been doing that, and for certain reasons there hasn't been things that have been changing, at least on a scale that maybe we would hope it would change in light of the money that's been given. And so, I mean, you mentioned issues like corrupt government, and there are a host of issues. So I think if someone with their own tax money has certain ideas of what that should go to, I would have a conversation with them. But I think churches have a really unique role to play.
And they're overwhelming problems. And the church does have a role to play, but again, in a larger picture, we as American Christians, we do have to use government and government policy to educate and make people aware of the economic situations, the role that we play as an economic driver in the world. And I think we need to work to change that, to make a change.
And alongside of Africa, all these statistics that were given about things that are going bad, the church is growing quite a bit there. And we talked about the civil society. The society of the church, I think, has a profound role to play in addressing issues like HIV and AIDS.